Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. I'm thankful to Ajit for inviting me. This is something that could only happen in Delaware because Chris Largent was one of my favorite teachers in high school. I've not seen him in 35 years till this stage. So, I have a Tommy. He's about 42. He's 6'4". He's ripped. He can look mean. He's a Green Beret. He will often tell me when we're playing a game that he is literally a trained killer. And he was walking through a neighborhood in Baltimore just recently, a month or so ago, in a tough neighborhood. He turned a corner, and he ran into a bunch of folk on the block who looked at him, and he said immediately there was a sense of tension, because they were wondering, what is this guy doing here? One point I left out is Tommy's head is shaved. He's got this scraggly beard, and they're thinking skinhead. Tommy was not alone. He had his 10-year-old son, Hunter, with him. And Hunter was about 2 steps behind, and he turned the corner just about 2 seconds later. And Hunter also has no hair on his head. He has no eyebrows. He is thin and pale and clearly a child who's fighting cancer. Tommy said there was an immediate reaction to everybody on that block, that they identified that he was a father who was in pain and who had shaved his head to identify with his son and to represent with him. And the sense of him as a skinhead was completely lost in the context of saying, here's a father loving his child. And everyone on that block responded to it. About 15 years ago, when we first started the program, this is a camp day this year, we have a thing called Camp Day. And there was a boy who was working for us. It was the first boy we hired. He's 14-year-old, lived on the east side where we started. He was living in motels on Route 9. When families are homeless, it's a very common place for them to wind up. And Tyrone and his mom were living there. He was an only child. And I went to pick him up Friday morning for the all-camp day. I said, don't want you to miss this. His bike had been stolen. He couldn't get in. There were no cell phones back then. Went to the desk. He called the room. Nobody came. I went and knocked on the door. And after a lot of noise, the door opened, and Tyrone walked out with his head down. And his mom came tumbling out, and some guy was cussing in the bed, and she was as high as a kite. And she grabbed a hold of my shirt and kind of held on to me to steady herself. She started to explain what was going on and why it was like this. And then she just broke down, and she sobbed. And she said, take care of my baby. Please take care of my baby. I never forgot it. Can't think of it today. I'm thinking about it. And we got in the car together, Tyrone and me. And we drove into Wilmington, and that was a long, quiet car ride. And I thought, he was sitting there ashamed and angry, and I was sitting there stunned, thinking, what do I say? I mean, 2 months earlier, in a previous life, I was hitting golf balls at Indian Wells and Palm Springs, and I didn't know what to say to him. I kept reflecting on what I'd heard, and I said, you know, Tyrone, one thing I want to tell you, as broken as it looks, your mom loves you a lot. Because I could feel that and see that. I never forgot that sense. I will never love a child the way that that parent or that guardian or that grandparent does. But I can do something, they tell me, which is to help take care of their baby. There are 2 points in those stories I wanted to go to. One is kids have an unbelievable capacity to summon the better angels of our nature. That's a quote from Lincoln's second inaugural address. If there's ever a time our country could use better angels of our nature, now would be a good time, 150 years later. But children, we recognize this is wrong. Some guy who screws up, we're going to throw him in jail, lock him away, but a child, that's not right. There should be a new opportunity. There should be hope and privilege and a future. And so all of us will connect to that. The second thing is that context matters. If I told you 2,000 years ago that I was texting, that would mean that I was weaving, because to text meant to weave. And I'll tell you, I have done a lot in my life to weave text. And when you weave it alone, it's just text. But if you weave it together, it's context. And that's what the fabric of society is built of. When those folk saw Tommy, a skinhead, they had text in their mind about what skinheads are and what they're about. When that 10-year-old boy turned a corner, immediately they had context. And the entire attitude of that block was changed. That there was a weaving together at a very basic level that transcended the differences, and there was power and beauty in that. In my case, I had text about that mom the day I walked up there. I had dropped them off before. I'd seen different men in the room, and I had this sense of what I thought I knew about it. And when I got there, the woman gave me context. She poured out her heart to me, and I could not be the same, because even to this day, the fabric she wove into my life is still part of the fabric and the tapestry of who I am today and what that means about what I have to do with my life. And it's the invitation, ultimately, I'm sharing with you today. Context is just a tool. It just places us in a situation that puts us someplace to see things differently. It casts vision. But to bring it life, it needs to have a name. And I'll mention, too, that we want to build community. At Urban Promise, our greatest strength is to use context and to use all these other tools to build community for a certain purpose. And community is about sharing. It is not about, I have an answer, and I have skills, and I'm going to come in and share that with you, and I'm going to fix you. Because that is condescension. That is not context. But if I go in and say, I have a huge amount of social capital. The people in this room have a huge reservoir of social capital that is missing from Tyrone's life 15 years ago, or from the kids today that Miss Avery Jones was referencing, and what they can do with that. And interestingly, social capital, you can invest all that you want and you don't lose it. You actually get more back. But you have to recognize that every kid in this city that has ever touched my life is filled with social capital. And I can tell you 100 stories of how they have poured into me, so that I have purpose and context and understanding, and I have a family that is much larger than I ever realized, and life is fuller. We don't have to wait for near-death experiences to experience an infinite love. How do you build community practically? It's great to have kumbaya thoughts and to have something happen on a block, but it ain't going to last more than 30 seconds when you walk down and things are changed. By the way, George Zimmerman had text in his mind about what a kid in a hoodie is about. If he had had context, he would not pursue that kid or had this attitude towards that. It's pervasive to our culture. The polarization of our culture is about text and not context. If you want to bring community out of context, you need to have a name. 19 years ago, the way I got distracted into doing all this was there was a problem with it. There was an Urban Promise in Camden. They had a small silkscreen printing shop, made shirts like this that they were using to train teens. And they asked me to come fix it. Long story about how that happened. I'm thinking, like, I could care less about Camden. It's an hour from where I live. I don't know anybody there. But there's a little bit of context, like, I'll just go up and go through the motions, because you got to look right? We are so overhyped on how to be politically correct. So I drove up there, thinking I'll go through the motions and I can leave. And I got introduced to this boy, the one boy they still had left, 19-year-old big kid. I shook his hand. It was like a catcher's mitt. And I got to know him, and I listened to his story, and the more I listened to it, the more it bothered me. And the crazy thing is, this boy's name is Clyde. I have never met a Clyde in the city before or since in any city I've worked in or done things with. And Clyde is the name of my oldest brother and of my father. What are the odds of that? Well, there's a message there. And I drove away from Camden that day, and I could not get out. Clyde could be my brother. And if Clyde was my brother, I could not drive away and do nothing. And it didn't matter if it was an hour away, because now I had a face and a name and a story that was woven into my life. And I couldn't leave it. So I spent a few years volunteering up there, driving up there, grumbling every time I was driving up. But every time I would think, if I didn't want to go, no, because Clyde depends on me. And I realized there came a point where the city had a name, and it wasn't Camden, it was Clyde. And I want us to rename the city of Wilmington. I want us to have a name of a child that you know that tells you, this is not about Wilmington, it's about that child. It's about Genesis, who sang so beautifully and powerfully on the stage, and all the story that she has to weave into our fabric. Another thing is, how do you actionalize that? We have a small high school we started, and we have a young man in that who was one of our first street leaders to graduate. In fact, he was the first street leader we had. These are kids we hire from the neighborhoods who work for us in the job training program and a mentoring program. We got him out of high school. It was nip and tuck that he would graduate high school. Barely made it. Good high school. Got him into college. It was a long saga. He graduated college, and now he's a teacher in our high school. And it's the fulfillment of our vision. We have several of those kids now, but they are far better equipped because they have elements of fabric and thread that are woven into their life that are much better equipped to serve the kids we serve. So it's cool to have that. And we had some unmotivated kids in our high school, a small school, and I said, James, what's your opinion? Like, what would work for these kids? What changed in you? Why did you go from an unmotivated, failing student to some kid who got out of high school and then went to college and then excelled? And he made a great comment I never forgot. He said, you know, to the school I thought, they knew my name, but they didn't really know me, and I didn't really know them. And so when they said, James, you're doing a lousy job, you can do much better, he said, like, I didn't care, because it didn't matter to me. But when he started working with us, he had Miss Kate and Mr. James and Mr. Linton. He had all these people in his life who were woven into his life, time at tutoring and working with him and mentoring him. And he said, when I failed or I did poorly on a test, it mattered that they were disappointed. I cared about what they thought because they cared about me. That there had been a community relationship built. So they had a name and they had a relationship that developed an intrinsic change in how that boy felt about his future and how he embraced the vision and potential that he had. And an intrinsic change in behavior, which is a massive need, is done through community. It's done through relationships and with names. Where does that put us today and where you're at? There are a ton of Jameses and Lintons and the folk who mentored these boys and children we've had all these years in this room. If there's 100 people here, there's 2,000 present from the people you know. Do you know the name of somebody in Wilmington that you will invest in, that you'll spend more than 30 days with? Two things. It was interesting. I was driving. Didn't sleep last night, all nervous about doing this, and walked out at lunch to go get a cup of coffee, clear my head, walked down past 4th Street. Coming back, 5 cop cars go flying by. This is just at lunchtime. And they have shut down West Washington Street with all these cops around it and an EMT and ambulance. So I said to some guy to me, 50-year-old white guy in a suit, said, you know, maybe there's been a shooting or something. And he looked down, and in a fairly cynical voice, he said, nah, wrong time of day, and then walked on. And I was intrigued. It couldn't have been more timely. That for him, the context is, I come into a city, I work safely, and I go home. And at night, people get shot, and that's their problem. Now, nobody here feels that way, because the fact is, first of all, you are full of knowledge. You are well-informed. You don't need more TEDtalks to be well-informed about the violence in the city, the poor educational situation, the lack of jobs, the criminal justice issues. And you are well-meaning. I have no question that we wouldn't be here today if you didn't care about our society, our community, and where it's going and how we can do something about that. But you are not well-placed. We are 3 blocks from Compton Apartments, public housing project with kids who have all these challenges and issues that deprive them. If we could see the kids like Hunter, a 10-year-old who lost all his hair, if we could see where they were ill and needed to be healed and restored, we would be highly motivated, like those folk on the block were. So how do you place yourself? I'm inviting you to get to know a child. And not just to know them. You can't do this on a board. You can't do it running a 5K. Those are good. They're constructive. We all need that. But if we want to change the city of Wilmington, if we want to fulfill the potential and promise, and if we want to have the privilege of having our lives changed, then we want to engage. Because there's that attribute of what I have to receive from children who have a worldview that's so different than mine, that's so informed and so insightful in unique ways I will never receive, that I can only receive from them, which I've been given for 15 years. I'll close with this thought. I was at an event in St. Joe's, one of our sites. We had these days. By the way, every one of these kids has a name. And one of you could know that child. They were sitting in St. Joe's. There's a special day we have for each camp, and they have their awards night. Parents come out. They're excited. The kids are performing, kind of like Genesis did. And I was sitting at the back, stay out of the way, and there was this little kid, and one of these things you stick kids in so they don't roll away. And about 8, 9 months old, and started fussing, and I started making a face at him to get his attention, and he started staring at me. He was a little freaky. And his mom picked him up and saw that he was staring at me real intently, and so she turned around. I hadn't paid attention. And she turned around and she said, "Oh, Mr. Rob, you scared me to death." And it was Reva Hardy. She was the first kid we hired. She worked with Tyrone 15 years ago. She had recently made a donation to our organization. I was stunned, out of the blue. And she had put a thing on Facebook about how she was just thankful for all the people in Urban Promise who had poured into her. I hadn't seen her in like 10 years. And here she was sitting in the program with a line of row of kids who were her kids, who were in this particular camp. And the interesting thing is my children are probably never going to get married. I'm never going to have grandchildren. But this 8-month-old kid, this was my first grandchild. This was Reva's child. And I knew her. And I have a relationship with her. And it was beautiful to be reunited with my family. So I'll say this. I invite you to join the family. Because the best way to change Wilmington is to give it a new name. The one that you're going to know. Thanks for listening. I'm grateful.